Test, test, test. Good evening, guys. You will probably hear piano music playing in the background. My family is getting their piano lessons out of the way currently, so my doors will keep some of that noise out, but you might overhear some of that going on. I'm not seeing tons of questions tonight. I see that Evan is inspiring other people to ask long lists of questions, and so I'm glad that you guys are helping Evan out because he was feeling sad by being the only one. And so we'll get started. Your questions, you can keep pouring them in, but hopefully you guys are finding this content to be pretty good for you. Let me turn on the volume. Yikes. So let's get started. I'll look at period 2 first and work my way through the rest of the classes. Miriam asked the questions, what battles are key for understanding World War II? Was there a turning point battle shifting dominance from Axis power to Allied powers? Really good question. So the way that I would look at World War II is keep in mind that World War II goes on from 1939 till 1945. America's entry isn't until 1941. So when we think about what's leading up to that, we want to be able to talk about trends like isolationism for the United States and appeasement for England, where they're trying to figure out ways to give Germany enough so that they stop being aggressive with their neighbors. We'll find that the mutual alliance that's going on between Russia and Germany to attack Poland in 1939 will be the official start of World War II, and then the collapse of France, the Battle of Britain, and those conflicts will be ones you want to know about for the European side of the war for the start. When it comes to the Pacific is notable for America's unwillingness to get into places like Manchuria, and that leads to the quarantine agreement that I see is being asked about by later questions that we'll get to. But in particular for America, the big turning point battles are these. Pearl Harbor in the Pacific is the start of World War II for the United States. And so that one's most vital. When it comes to Europe, knowing that for the Americans, even though the Russians, after they're betrayed by the Germans in 1940, and they're seeking a second front to the war to be opened up by the United States, knowing that America started in the Atlantic Ocean clearing out U-boats, then going through North Africa, Italy, and then especially the most notable battle in Europe is going to be D-Day and the invasion at Normandy. And then finally the Battle of the Bulge, where that's the final German counterattack that's going to take place. When it comes to the war itself, though, those battles, Pearl Harbor, D-Day, they're important to know about. It's rare that you get a lot of questions that are tuned into just those battles because the war was so much bigger than just a couple battles, but those are turning points. In the Pacific, Pearl Harbor is important. Midway is the turning point where at Midway, the Japanese military is trying to expand outwards. And at the Battle of Midway, you have your first aircraft carrier battle where neither sets of ships see one another. But the Americans are able to sink the Japanese aircraft carriers, and they're not going to be able to rebuild them. So from that point forward, Midway is the furthest that the Japanese are going to expand outwards, and then they're being collapsed inwards throughout the rest of the war. And that's going to lead us to island hopping, which is another question that I saw just a little bit ago, and that has certain battles that are tied to it as well. Knowing about Stalingrad, though, is going to be important because with Stalingrad, that's going to be the turning point of World War II in 1942 and 1943. That's going to be the Germans extending out as far as they can into Russian territory. The Russians will push them back, and in fact, that's going to be the moment when the Russians are realizing that America is not really an ally of theirs in the truest sense of the words. They're willing to allow the Russians and the Germans to kill one another as America's moving through North Africa and into Italy. And so that mistrust is going to eventually lead us from World War II into the Cold War. What's up, Abby?
Are your keys in your jacket?
I think so. Okay. So hopefully that answers your questions. If you've got any others, that's going to be pretty much where the battles questions are going to be coming from. TJ, you've got a question. What did the Americans think before the war? What was their mindset? Overwhelmingly, Americans going from the end of World War I forward are of an isolationist mindset, with the feeling that they went into World War I with the idea they were going to make the world safe for democracy, and this would be the war to end all wars. As they moved through the 1920s, they realized they had not ended wars and that they had created an environment with the Treaty of Versailles that was going to lead to another conflict fairly quickly. And so for Americans, they felt like World War I was a mess because they violated George Washington's principles of staying out of European conflicts. And so for many Americans, they were isolationist, and you're going to see Franklin Roosevelt in this chapter nudging Americans further and further along to becoming more interventionist instead of being isolationist. Now, when it came to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the way to think about the Japanese expansion is they were imperialistic, and overwhelmingly they kept running into Americans who are willing to cave in rather than stand up for their possessions. So during the Washington Naval Conference, America was willing to cave in and not keep their navy strong, which was a signal of weakness to the Japanese military. When it came to the Washington Naval Conferences, the Japanese military was able to get the Americans to agree that they wouldn't fortify military bases in the Pacific like the Philippines, even though that should have been a warning sign to the Americans that that could be a very dangerous situation that they're entering into. When Japan went into Manchuria and then attacked China without America fighting back, all of those were signals that the United States was soft. And the fact that they had stuck with the Washington Naval Conference showed that their Navy was not up to snuff. And so that's why they attacked at Pearl Harbor. So with TJ, the question that he's asking is, what were the main motivations for Pearl Harbor? The Japanese military realized that the Americans had allowed their Navy to not maintain pace with the Japanese. The feeling was that if Japan could attack Pearl Harbor and blow up all the American ships, including the aircraft carriers, that would then paralyze the American fleet, and that would prevent the Americans from being able to fight back against the Japanese until the Japanese had conquered all of the Pacific and fortified it so that the Americans couldn't take it again. There was also a feeling that the Americans were soft because if you hit them once that they would back down based on what they'd seen for the previous 2 decades. One of the conspiracy theories about Pearl Harbor is just a few days before the Pearl Harbor attacks happened, the decision was made to move the Pacific aircraft carrier fleet out of harbor. So when Pearl Harbor got hit, you'll see a lot of images of Battleship Row and battleships getting blown up. Those were the old style of weapons during World War I. The new aircraft carriers weren't in the military base to be attacked, and that's what allowed us to still have protection and some capabilities in the Pacific after the attack took place. Annika, let's go through your laundry list. The first question is explaining the Havana Conference of 1940. In 1940, World War II was already underway. A number of countries had already been attacked. Belgium had been attacked. France had been attacked. And the term that they used for these countries in Latin America is that they had been orphaned, although that's a really weird term to use. But essentially the countries that had been the colonial influences had now been conquered by Germany or Italy, and they were now unable to maintain their colonies. And these countries were then looking for mutual protection against advances that might be coming from Europe. So at the Havana Conference, Franklin Roosevelt is going to tweak the Monroe Doctrine. So instead of it being America dominating Latin America, it was going to be a mutual alliance agreement where all of the countries in the Americas were going to work with one another to resist the attempts of dictators to try to move into the Western Hemisphere. So that's what's going on at the Havana Conference. Korematsu versus the United States is a Supreme Court decision dealing with internment. And so we had during World War II a decision made by Franklin Roosevelt that has gone down in history in really negative ways, where he made the determination that because Japanese spies in Pearl Harbor had helped with the attack that took place in 1941, he made the decision to force all Japanese citizens living on the west coast of the United States to sell their stuff rapidly in sales that were never going to get the true market value for their stuff, because everybody knew that the Japanese citizens had to sell as quickly as possible. And then they were relocated to prison bases in the deserts of the western part of the United States called internment camps. These individuals were forced into these camps. The only way they could really get out is if they served in the military, but even then they weren't trusted to serve in the Pacific for fear that they would turn on the United States, and so they were forced to serve in places like Italy where they fought with distinction. The court case Korematsu versus the United States, though, is one where a person interned in an internment camp sued, arguing that he was being imprisoned in violation of his protections in the Bill of Rights. And what the Supreme Court determined was during times of war, the United States government does have the jurisdiction to be able to imprison people that they suspect are foreign enemies who might do bad things to the United States. Now, to be transparent with everything, when we think about what's happening here, the Supreme Court made that decision back in 1944. During Ronald Reagan's presidency, though, it was determined that reparations should be paid because this was an injustice and it should not be seen as a highlight of American history. And so at that time, a very conservative Ronald Reagan very much came out and said in recognition that this was not something that should have happened. And even during FDR's time, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, who had moved up the ranks during Prohibition, this leader of the FBI, our internal investigation group, told Franklin Roosevelt, there isn't a threat like you think there is, and this is an overreaction. But FDR kind of felt pressured by people who were hysterical with the war effort, and so he was cowed by them. When it comes to Korematsu, keep in mind also there are Italian and German people who are being locked up in internment camps as well. But for these individuals, they have to do something that is demonstrably an enemy of the state sort of action, where Japanese citizens are just being locked up because they're Japanese. Let me see here. The Potsdam Conference. Potsdam Conference, very simply, and your textbook's weird because at the start of the next chapter, they're going to talk to you about the Yalta Conference, where that should be inside this chapter, and then Potsdam is dealt with inside this chapter itself. Yalta and Potsdam are two meetings that take place, along with Casablanca, which is a third, and then the Atlantic Charter, which is the fourth, where you have leaders of Europe who are getting together and meeting to discuss what the war strategies are going to be. So let's start off, first of all, with the Atlantic Conference and the Atlantic Charter. That is Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt meeting in the North Atlantic, and they get together to discuss what it's going to look like with the American-British alliance. Later, those two meet in Casablanca to come up with war aims that they've got for the beginnings of the war in North Africa. But later on, what we want to be noticing is meetings between what's known as the Big Three. At Yalta, it's going to be Franklin Roosevelt, Churchill, and Joseph Stalin talking about what should be happening with Europe when the war is done. And then Potsdam is happening after Franklin Roosevelt has died. Harry Truman, his vice president, will go to Potsdam. He'll meet with Clement Attlee, who has replaced Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. And the discussion there is, what do we do with the Pacific? And in the Pacific, Russia is making comments that they would like to do something to help out with the war effort in the Pacific. But there's a lot of concern that the Russians might want to do in the Pacific what they did in Europe, where they were conquering territories and putting them under their control. And so there's a bit of fear going on at Potsdam with Harry Truman that the Russians might get a little bit too aggressive. At Potsdam, though, Harry Truman's also got in his possession a couple atomic weapons that he's planning on using to threaten and possibly force the Japanese government into surrender. And so that's what's happening at Potsdam at the very end of the war. War in Europe has ended. War in the Pacific still needs to be finished up. And that's where he's calling, Harry Truman's calling for unconditional surrender from Japan. Let me see here. So we got Potsdam, Atlantic Charter. And then finally, the question that you've got posted is what's going on with the Lend-Lease Act. And so let me backtrack you a step. And so here are the steps that you want to be noticing in your notes for Chapter 33. Poland gets attacked in 1939 by Germany and Russia attacking simultaneously. At that point, World War II got started, but the hope that Americans had was that France would be able to hold on by being able to use its Maginot Line to defend against German attack. France, though, has not finished its Maginot Line. It's not built in front of Belgium, and so Belgium is left exposed. And so Germany is going to quickly go steaming into France and conquer it within a matter of weeks. It's at that point, when England is the last remaining country that can defend against the Germans, that they're going to be creating the cash and carry decision, where if other countries can take boats and bring them across the Atlantic Ocean and load up with our supplies and drop off their money, they can then bring supplies back over to Europe. Which will keep us neutral, but it will also allow us to make money off the war and help supply our friends, especially England. When the Battle of the Blitz got started, though, the Battle of Britain, when England is getting bombed by the Germans, FDR is going to change his strategy from cash and carry to lend lease. And his idea is he's going to come to Congress and say, we are going to lend all of the war materials that the British need so that they can use them through the rest of the war. And he uses a metaphor of a garden hose, imagining if your neighbor's house was on fire and they asked to borrow your garden hose, you wouldn't ask them if they could pay it or if they're going to carry it themselves. You would lend them the garden hose, and then if the hose got damaged while fighting the fire, then your neighbor could pay you back when the fire was put out. In that metaphor, then, England is the house that's on fire, and we're going to be supplying them not with hoses, but with tanks and planes and that sort of stuff. And many isolationists were angry because they said you can't lend England bullets. But getting back to TJ's question, by the time we got to the point where France got overrun and Russia and Germany are on the same team and England was getting blasted, more and more Americans were moving away from the America First mentality of isolationism and possibly even being pro-German. And they were moving more in the direction of being interventionist to aid the British against dictatorships that were obviously very aggressive with their neighbors. So hopefully that helps out. Let me scan down here. Evan, I see a few different bullet points here. First of all, Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War is going to be a conflict that takes place, and it's seen as like a trial run of Adolf Hitler's brand new weaponry that he's going to use to try to help the rise of a fascist dictatorship in Spain. So in Spain, they had a stable government that was in place that was pro-Western civilization. England, France, America were friends with this government. And what Adolf Hitler did is he helped to prop up a dictator named Francisco Franco, who was a fascist like Benito Mussolini and like Adolf Hitler. Hitler was able to get into Spain all sorts of new weapons that he was building for his military machine. He sends in planes, he sends in bombs, he's helping out the rebels, and in return, America is stuck because they've got the Neutrality Acts and they can't send aid to help out the prop up the Spanish government that we're friendly with, and instead it gets toppled by fascists who are using these weapons and aids from Hitler and Mussolini to establish a fascist dictatorship on the western part of Europe. What we see there then is the falling of another country to fascism and moving away from being pro-democracy, pro-friendly like the previous government had been. Let me see here. The second question, what are the goals and outcomes of the Atlantic Conference? The goals were to align America and British war aims, especially with Winston Churchill trying to hammer out specific details to get supplies and aid because they were on the verge of collapse during the Battle of Britain. So that's what they're up to is Churchill spends weeks beforehand trying to work Franklin Roosevelt into an alliance, and Franklin Roosevelt during that time is trying to work America from being isolationist to interventionist. And so it's at that point they start coming down to nuts and bolts as far as what that alliance is going to look like. The next question is asking about the strategy of leapfrogging in the Pacific. Just notice that when you read chapter 34 about the Pacific, you have Japanese soldiers that are embracing the Bushido Code, or the Code of the Samurai, which means that they see surrender as the most awful option that they could have for maintaining pride in themselves and pride in their military. And so you're going to find that they're engaging in things like kamikaze attacks or suicidal attacks because of the fact that they believe they should fight to the death. They're also in a strange place because their leader, the emperor, has been propped up as not just being human, but being a godlike figure as the leader of their country. And he has sent out the message that if they are going to be obedient, they are going to fight to the death for the purpose of protecting their emperor. So when it came to America's time to start moving across the Pacific Ocean, they could conquer every tiny island that has an outpost that the Japanese soldiers have set up on. But then that means hand-to-hand fighting where you are going into cave structures and trying to find Japanese soldiers who are willing to sacrifice themselves suicidally. Or else what you could do is you could hop over them. And so what General Douglas MacArthur came up with was the idea of island hopping. Hop the island that has Japanese soldiers but has no strategic value, and instead you're trying to create this span that you can protect with air power. So if you can take up an island, create air power like this, you might have other islands in the area. You could bomb the daylights out of them with your brand new air base, and then you just hop to the next island that strategically is going to be able to build another air base for you, and you just repeat the process, gradually moving across the Pacific Ocean until you take over places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And if you're asking about locations in the Pacific, those are two very important places, because once we conquer those two islands, we can then use them to stage air attacks that will attack Japan, especially to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that are going to deliver atomic weapons and World War II. Let me see here. The next question I see right here is asking about what is storm cellar neutrality? That is another term for isolationism. And so imagine that if there's a tornado coming and you hunker down in the storm cellar and you can't see anything that is happening outside, but you've got this illusion of safety while you've got a tornado bearing down on you. That's kind of like isolationism in 1940, where you've got Europe crumbling. And it's pretty apparent that if Europe completely falls apart, America's going to be next. And so the idea that you're going to be isolationist and all of this push for dictatorships is never going to reach the United States. By the time we get to 1940, 1941, only the most extremely isolationist people are still holding on to that America First policy. And most of them are realizing that they're going to need to fight against either Japan or Germany or both because of their aggressiveness. And then finally, you're asking about the arsenal of democracy. An arsenal is a production facility for weapons. And so what America decides to do, what Franklin Roosevelt announces, is that America is going to become an arsenal for democracy, where he sets these really lofty goals that he's going to create these many Liberty ships, which are transporting goods across the ocean, like food and ammunition, whatever. They aren't warships. They're just delivering all the supplies that are needed to our allies. And we're going to build tanks and planes and bombs and bullets. And the idea is we're not just going to produce them for ourselves. We're going to be the producer of weapons for Canada and England and France and Russia and Australia and a whole host of other allies. And it's going to serve two purposes. Number one, we had an overproduction problem to start Great Depression. Overproduction is not an issue during World War II. And if we can supply the weapons to other countries, they might be able to do the fighting for us, so we don't need to sacrifice American soldiers on all fronts. We can just supply cutting-edge weaponry to individuals around the world who are trying to fight the same enemy that we have. Let me see here. Caden, what are the most important battles that we need to know for the test? Hopefully when I was answering Miriam's question, I satisfied your question as well, but if you have questions further, please let me know. Sabrina, can I explain unconditional surrender in U.S.-Latin relations leading up to the war? Sure. Unconditional surrender was the idea that with Germany and Italy and Japan, a conditional surrender would mean that they would surrender with certain strings attached, like they could still maintain their military forces or they could still maintain their style of government. And what was determined by Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman was that they really wanted unconditional surrender to not just end the war against Germany, but to eradicate Nazism or fascism in Italy, to get rid of the dictatorship in Japan that had spawned this militaristic culture that was then very expansionistic. And so for America, that's the sticking point, is there's a question if we could have ended World War II earlier in the Pacific with the conditional surrender with Japan. And in Harry Truman's mind, that's absolutely unacceptable because we wanted to end their aggressiveness towards their neighbors. The other question Sabrina is asking is about U.S.-Latin American relations leading up to the war. In the 1920s, we had a movement by Hoover towards what was known as good neighbor diplomacy. And the good neighbor policy was carried on by Franklin Roosevelt, with the understanding that prior to World War I, you had Germany trying to make relationships with Mexico, and you had other countries that were being targeted when Teddy Roosevelt enforced the Roosevelt Corollary. But what Franklin Roosevelt's trying to figure out is he realizes all of these military interventions are making a lot of countries really not like the United States. And so there's an anti-United States feeling that's going on in Latin America. And so what's going to be happening with the U.S. Latin American relations is FDR and Hoover are trying to improve them. And then that's where the Havana Conference comes in, where they're meeting with one another with the idea that they need to defend one another against attempts by an Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini to move into territories that might be vulnerable now that these colonies have lost their connections to a France that has now been conquered, or other countries that have been toppled during World War II. So hopefully that's helps you guys. This is period 2's questions that it looks like I'm finished with. I'll move on to period 4. Kirsten, hopefully my explanation for island hopping helped out with your question to start off this. When it comes to how did island hopping affect the war, island hopping is going to be a technique that is going to save a lot of Americans' lives. But we're going to find that they describe the ABC-1 policy where Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt decide that it's much more important to fight the war in Europe first. So the wars are being fought simultaneously, but there's much more energy being put into the war in Europe in order to try to figure out ways to help out the colonial countries like England so that they could hopefully then provide aid in the Pacific once the pressure is off of them about Nazi Germany. Let me see here. The next question I see is about Wendell Willkie. Wendell Willkie is just a presidential candidate who is running against Franklin Roosevelt, and he is one of the candidates who is pursuing election after Franklin Roosevelt has now decided to move past the 2-term limit that was created by George Washington. He is going to fail in his presidential run, and then once he is done with his run for the presidency, he is going to unite with Franklin Roosevelt to demonstrate that both Republicans and Democrats are united in World War II against the threats that we're facing from outside the country. Another question that I see here is, can I explain the destroyers for bases deal? Very simply put, when you think about the period after the fall of France, the English Channel is now undefended between England and France. The battle at Dunkirk, where the British had to evacuate in order to flee the Germans, has now forced the English to leave behind tons of their war materials that could be used to protect the country, but now they've been lost to the Germans. So the deal that's made between Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill, while we're still in that period of neutrality acts, cash and carry, lend-lease, is known as the Destroyers for Bases deal, where we gave 50 old World War I style destroyers to the British so that they could use them as a basic defense against a land invasion by the Germans along the English Channel after the fall of France. We were then given 99-year leases to British military bases that were here in the Americas so that we could then use them for military operations. So we weren't technically giving away materials, it was a trade. And so Roosevelt wasn't technically violating the Neutrality Acts, but he's pushing it quite a bit because he is giving war materials to England, which is definitely not maintaining neutrality. We are definitely allied with the British rather than with the Germans as a result of that deal. Sam has a question about, can I go into deeper meaning about the Manhattan Project? Simply put, the Manhattan Project was a project that was created from the inspiration of Albert Einstein, a Jewish scientist who fled Germany because he didn't want to be rounded up in the Holocaust. He came to the United States and he told Franklin Roosevelt in a letter that the Germans had been working for a while on unleashing the power of the atom. And he mentioned to them, these are the components they're looking for, these are the materials that will help them build a bomb. If they're allowed to get it, they will have a weapon that is unimaginable in its power. And so Franklin Roosevelt was inspired by Albert Einstein's inspiration, and he creates the Manhattan Project, a super secret plan that has multiple different locations. The closest one for you is the University of Chicago, where they took that university and underneath the football field they built a top secret lab. So if you've ever seen like Captain America, the first movie, where they're doing like experiments in the center of New York City, same sort of feel to it, where they've got a secret military base underneath the University of Chicago football field where they're working on developing a nuclear bomb. And then as they work throughout the war, they are able to get closer and closer to creating a bomb until finally, when they get to the Potsdam Convention, they've now got a couple bombs that they can use. They're not certain if they will or will not go off, but they've tested one in the desert and it's worked. And so they've got a feeling that if they drop one of these things, it should work. But they're different configurations, different mechanical styles, different materials going into them, and so it's kind of all a crapshoot to find out if it's actually going to work out when they get to the end of the war. Sam, you had a question about the good neighbor policy. Hopefully, when I was answering what was going on in Latin America, that was something that was taken care of. Kirsten, I see. What was the quarantine speech? The way to think of the quarantine speech is this is when Japan started getting aggressive in challenging America's role in defending China with the open door policy. Franklin Roosevelt couldn't come out and declare war because we had the Neutrality Acts. And those Neutrality Acts, you have no idea if he pushes them too hard, if that will lead to an impeachment of Franklin Roosevelt, kind of like you saw with the Tenure of Office Act with Andrew Johnson back during the Reconstruction era. For Franklin Roosevelt, he also understands that a lot of Americans aren't super excited about going to war, even more so over the idea of protecting China from Japan, because there are a lot of racial implications to that, and it is so distant from the United States. So what Franklin Roosevelt does is he kind of dips his toes into the water about the idea that we've got dictatorships in Japan, Italy, and Germany, and what he announces is that as a world, we need to figure out ways to quarantine these countries, almost as if they were carrying a disease, and you were going to quarantine an ill person by isolating them for a while until the disease passes. So what he's talking about doing is he's talking about creating an embargo on the Japanese and preventing them from getting war supplies and putting pressure on them to stop being so expansionistic. So even though this isn't a declaration of war, it is definitely signaling to the Japanese that we're not happy with what they're doing, and we're thinking about possibly pushing back against them. And then afterwards, when we do create an embargo against Japan in 1941, this eventually leads to the Pearl Harbor attacks, where they realize if there's an embargo cutting off their rubber and their gasoline and their steel, they're not going to be able to fight effectively. And so that's why they try to wipe out our Navy fleet at Pearl Harbor at that time. Let me see here. Matthew has a question. Can I go into depth on unconditional surrender and the effects that it would have on countries post-war? Hopefully I satisfied that question with the idea that they're going to be trying to eradicate the fascism or the dictatorships that are aggressively expansionistic as a result of that unconditional surrender. Anna, I see your question about the Battle of Midway and the Battle of Coral Sea. The Battle of Midway, hopefully I've satisfied you the question with that. The Battle of Coral Sea is America's Navy intercepting a Japanese fleet that was about to attack Australia, and they were trying to conquer that so that they could take over another military base. Fortunately, America was able to head off the Japanese fleet and prevent the invasion at Australia at the Battle of Coral Sea. Let me see here. Matthew, in the 1940 election, was FDR and Willkie both pro-Britain and pro-isolation? They were. It's one of those classic examples of a politician saying exactly what the voters want to hear them say. So kind of like Woodrow Wilson in 1916 campaigned on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." FDR was talking about his isolationism, all the while behind the scenes actively trying to figure out ways to gradually convince Americans to see that they were moving towards interventionism. And so that's going to be one of the attacks that Wendell Willkie will make on FDR after the election is done, is that he's nudging us towards interventionism. But after Pearl Harbor, all of those concerns wash away, because once Japan attacks us, it becomes obvious that the attack didn't come from nowhere. It'd been happening for a while. And very much everybody then at that point rallies around the idea of being pro-war. Let me see here. Matthew has another question. Who wanted Henry Wallace removed from being FDR's vice president, and why? There were a lot of Democrats who were worried because Henry Wallace was a very liberal individual. So he is much further to the left on the political spectrum than Franklin Roosevelt was, and he was making Southern Democrats in particular very nervous about the stances he was taking on a number of different issues. And they were very much especially concerned about what he was going to do with civil rights. So they replaced him with Harry Truman, who was a much more moderate Democrat in the 1944 election. The big takeaway, though, is when Wallace is removed and Harry Truman is put in, Truman is going to become vice president. FDR will die just a few weeks after he is inaugurated. And when he dies, nobody has actually told Harry Truman what the Manhattan Project is or how far along it is. And so out of nowhere, he gets dropped on him. You're taking over for a guy who just got elected for his fourth term. He's trying to wrap up World War II. You're trying to negotiate with Joseph Stalin. And by the way, you have these atomic weapons that could vaporize cities. And so he was put into a pretty tricky spot when he became president. Let me see here. What are the significant islands from the Pacific? Hopefully, Matthew, I've been able to cover that well enough. Why did Russia want to fight in the end of the Pacific battle with Japan? Big takeaway with Joseph Stalin is there's a number of different elements that are going on there. At the end of World War II, Joseph Stalin was incredibly angry about how he had been treated by his neighbors. That's a justifiable viewpoint. He is part of a country that has been kicked around in the Russo-Japanese War. So the Japanese have attacked and defeated the Japanese military just a few decades earlier. At this point, Germany has invaded not once but twice. He wants to punish them severely. Woodrow Wilson sent troops into Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution to try to crush the Communist Revolution. And now he's got some pretty angry feelings about the United States and the British because we've allowed them to absorb the brunt of the German attacks while America was in North Africa and Italy. So at the end of World War II, at Yalta, it was determined that they were going to figure out ways to give democracy to European countries that had been part of the German Empire. But when Russia took them over, they're going to drop what's called an Iron Curtain across Europe. He is going to make those countries communist. And it becomes very apparent that they're not going to get democracy or freedom. When Joseph Stalin then says at Potsdam that he would like to help out in the Pacific, there are a lot of people who are suspicious that he's saying that not because he wants to help out the spread of democracy, but perhaps he would like to punish Japan, but then also he might be hoping to conquer a lot of territory that they've got that he would like to lay his hands on. So when we think about what's going on with Russia's decision at the end of World War II, that's a lot of what's taking place there. Let me see here, period 6. Okay, so for the first question, Hallie's got a number of different questions going on here. For the Havana Conference with the United States agreeing to protect Latin American countries from Germany, did that exclude Mexico since Germany and Mexico shared common grievances during World War I? That is a fantastic question. I tried to Google search that before I started the review. I couldn't find any information about that, but it was a really cursory glance because I didn't have a lot of time to look it over. I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I know that it's not going to be important for AP US history. It's a very good premise that you are making, and I'm not certain. I know that they're trying to round up a number of different countries from Latin America to create good friendships with them. And you saw during the Franklin Roosevelt presidency that he was, with the good neighbor policy, willing to allow the Mexican government to nationalize oil that had been set aside by American companies. So it wouldn't surprise me in the least if Mexico was invited to Havana and most likely went, but I'm not certain. Let me see here. Second bullet point, what was the relationship between the USSR and the US like after the German invasion of the United States? Of the USSR. The best way to put it is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so we have an alliance where we share an enemy with one another, but it's not like the two countries trust one another. America is sending Lend-Lease supplies to Russia, so they're getting an awful lot of war materials coming from the United States to help them out with the war effort, and we are collaborating during meetings like Yalta and Potsdam to discuss strategies for how we're going to be fighting the war, but it's always with the feeling that we're not certain how much we can trust them, they're not certain how much they can trust us, and so there's a lot of tension going on there. Third bullet point, what did the War Labor Board do? It is just like the War Production Board that you have during World War I, where FDR is figuring out who's going to be producing what for the United States government. There are all sorts of rationing plans that are going on, so you can't buy a brand new car or other sorts of appliances during the war because those materials are being used for the war effort. And FDR is collaborating with transportation and unions and whatever to mass produce our way into creating an arsenal of democracy. Let me see here. Can I explain how significant new arms in World War II battles helped the Allies? We have an office that is set up during the war that is doing all sorts of research to create new technologies. Radar is being created, sonar is being created, new tank technologies, plane technologies. You run the gamut, and they're coming up with all these inventions, but so are the other countries that are involved in the war. The thing that makes America so successful in the war is our ability to outproduce our enemies. So the Germans are going to have much nicer technological tanks than the United States will have, but those tanks require a lot of materials and they take a lot of time to create. Meanwhile, we can create a Sherman tank in hours, and we can crank out dozens of them in the time that it takes to make a few for the Germans. And so even though the German tanks will be better created, ours will be more plentiful, and that's going to help us overwhelm the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese with our arsenal of democracy. Let me see here. Bullet point number 5. Did the Manhattan Project start after Germany's surrender? If so, why would they target Germany for the atomic bomb if Germany had already... Okay, so the Manhattan Project is going to start well before the German surrender. So it's going to be going on throughout World War II. And it's just taking that long with research to determine the right proportion of fissionable material with the destruction capabilities that they're looking for, and they realize they have to do this in top secret. So they're working on it throughout the war, and it's only at the very end of the war that they've actually got any working models that they can use. But they don't develop those until after Germany has fallen. In Germany, though, they have been using a different type of bombing, so they've been firebombing cities, and that's been equally destructive, where they've been doing an awful lot of terroristic attacks on the civilians in Germany, very much like the Germans had been doing to the British during the Battle of the Blitz. And so we're going to find that this is the first war where it becomes totally acceptable for civilians to be counted as targets of war, and the ethical ramifications of that are still being felt nowadays. Let me see here. Celia, hopefully my explanation of Korematsu earlier took care of your question. If you've got any more, definitely feel free to let me know. I read, let me see, Kala, I read somewhere that Germany hid their concentration camps from the outside world and staged towns to look normal to the media so no one knew what was going on for a while. Is this true? They did have concentration camps that were away from city centers so they could have some sort of plausible deniability. And there were people in Germany and Poland who claimed that they knew nothing about the concentration camps were nearby. The question is, how legitimate could that be with the smell of burning flesh and the trains coming in and whatever. And so after World War II was done, there were attempts by the American military to force the civilians in the area to march through concentration camps to look at what they had condoned and allowed happening in their backyards. We do have evidence that the United States government was aware of what was going on with the Holocaust. It was in some newspapers. They were aware, especially during the Olympics that Jesse Owens participated in. And then with the boat called the St. Louis, the decision was made to send Jews back to Europe so that it wouldn't be seen as provoking Adolf Hitler by aiding people against his Holocaust. But as far as the extent of what was going on, there's all sorts of different takes on what was happening. It is one of the darker moments in United States history, though, that was allowed to take place without a stronger response from the United States. But then the dilemma that they also have is with their isolationism that they had going on during the period from the 1920s to the 1930s. They didn't have the military wherewithal anyways to do much of anything if they wanted to jump in and do anything about it. You also have, as we headlined for you, there is all sorts of anti-Semitism going on inside the United States, like they described with the New Deal, where people were referring to it as the Jew deal because there were Jewish people working for Franklin Roosevelt inside the New Deal, and there were all sorts of slanders and slurs that were thrown around as a result of that. So you're asking a question that's got hours of stuff that goes into it, but you're absolutely right that there were attempts to try to conceal from the regular people in Europe what was going on, and how successful they were is a matter of debate. Let me see here, Trina. How important is the style of which the battles were fought? There isn't going to be many questions asking you about the style of battles. The only thing that I would really encourage you to think about is each time you see a leap in warfare, it really is signaling for you a global shift as far as what's going to be happening with foreign policy from that point forward. So from Civil War to World War One, you see an increase in technology that's being used, but the style of warfare remains relatively the same. You have two trenches aiming at one another, people marching slowly across the middle, and you've got weapons that were started during the Civil War that are perfected during World War One that are defensive in nature. At the end of World War One, they're figuring out offensive weapons. They're figuring out planes and tanks. And so when you look at the start of World War Two, that's where you see the flaw going on with the French and the creation of the Maginot Line, where they're thinking, this will be another World War One all over again. I'm going to build a super trench. And in reality, the Germans have rethought what warfare is. It's not so much the Navy that is most important or the Army, it's that Air Force where you can fly planes over your enemy and bomb them, or take tanks and go around your enemy who is on foot. And it's this new revolution in warfare is what the Germans are good at, and the French haven't prepared for as well as they need to. The Americans are going to meet them with that standard, and so will the Russians. And so after World War II is done, America and Russia will become the preeminent militaries then from embracing the new styles of warfare. And then also those atomic bombs that are coming onto the scene, America and Russia will be the two leading people who have, and two leading countries that have them. And that's going to be the face of war from that point all the way up until where we are now. Kala, could I explain more as to why fascists and communists hate one another? Okay, so remember the graphic that I showed you where you've got to the left and to the right communists and fascists who are about as far apart on the political spectrum as you can get, but when it comes to their style of governing, they're very similar because they like to create totalitarian dictatorships. Communism has the idea that the government runs everything. There are no rich people, there are no poor people, everybody is equal, the government is in control, and they make all decisions for the people, and they share all their wealth equally. On the other end of the spectrum with fascism, fascism does not go that direction. And what gets a lot of kids confused is they'll be like, well, the Nazis were socialists because they call themselves the Nazi Socialist Party, but the National Socialist Party. But there's a problem with that. Their version of socialism isn't what communism is. It's something different. And so when you look at what the Nazi fascists are, they believe in an ultra-patriotic, ultra-nationalistic style of government where you have capitalism, you have free enterprise, you can make as much money as you want to. You just have to do everything in your life for the good of the leader and of the country, or else you're going to get on the wrong side of the government. Loyalty is key, and so if you are somebody who is not intensely loyal and you're not blindly obedient, there is a solid chance that you will lose your companies. You might even find yourself being treated as an enemy of the people, and you might be put into a concentration camp or investigated by the police. And inside that government, they are very nervous about having everybody be equal and have everybody share things the same. That's not what they believe economically. And since those people who are communist are not blindly obedient to the fascist viewpoints, they're then on the outs. So you either blindly obey, or else you've got problems with the leadership. And you either totally fit in with the in group, or else you're in the out group and you're the enemy of the people. So that's why the fascists and the communists are hating each other in a nutshell. It's so much deeper than that, and you'll see more of that when you move on to your world history courses and your politics courses, but hopefully that gives you a taste of what's going on. You'll find that for the remainder of the course, though, a lot of our focus is going to be on communism as we move into a Cold War battle between the United States and the Russians, and we'll talk more about what we see going on with fascism as we get deeper into the course. Can I explain FDR's view on foreign trade policy? For FDR's foreign trade policy, he's trying to figure out ways to trade with other countries, but he is also nervous about taking down tariffs completely because of the fact that Americans would be competing with other countries that might have low-wage labor, and that would then drive down the labor opportunities that are available here inside the United States. So, Kent, your question revolves around the term that we learned about, where he was creating what was known as reciprocal treaties, where if we were allowed to trade with another country and they lowered their tariff for us, we would lower our tariff for them. So for dozens of countries during this time period, we make special side deals where we'll say that we've got a tariff, but for this country, we're going to ignore it for these products, or for this country, we'll ignore it for everything and impose a different tariff rate for them and us because they'll be seen as like a most favored nation status. So that's what FDR is up to. He's trying to figure out ways to increase trade while also not taking away some protections that might protect workers from competition from outside the country. Let me see here. Brooke, what are the important points to know or understand about United States military warfare in North Africa? In North Africa, you've largely got tank battles. And in North Africa, the thing that I'd like you to keep in mind for both North Africa and Russia, Germany is attacking in those two places because they need oil. They've got great factories, they've got all of these technologies, but kind of like Japan, they do not have all the resources internally that they need to fight a war. This is where America's got that unique value of having the western part of the United States, where we've got all sorts of resources that we can use, including oil that's coming from Mexico and the southern part of the United States, all sorts of materials coming from the western part of our country. Germany and Japan don't have that, and Germany needs oil to run their Panzers, which are gigantic, super armored tanks that are incredibly good, but they also guzzle gas like crazy. And so what's happening is when you see Stalingrad in your textbook, that's an attempt by the Germans to go into Russia so that hopefully they can get to oil reserves that are in the southern parts of Russia or in the Middle East. When it comes to North Africa, the Germans are trying to take out over Egypt in the eastern part of Africa so they can take over the Suez Canal, and they can then send their ships from the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal and be able to influence either the Middle East or go help out in Asia. But then also if they take over the Suez Canal, they can move into the Middle East, places like Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and they could start taking oil from there if they can take those areas away from the British. So that's what they're up to in North Africa when they're trying to do what they're doing militarily. And that's why it's so important that when the British in Egypt and the Americans over on the other side of the continent merge together and they're able to push Rommel out of North Africa, that really puts a crimp in the Germans' plans. And then when also the Russians are able to turn back the Germans at Stalingrad, both of the options that the Germans had for gasoline are going to be gone for them. So hopefully that helps out. If you got other questions, feel free to post. Let me refresh each of the classes and see if there's any other questions that I am currently missing. Let me see here. Christian, how did Japan become imperialistic despite lacking raw materials? Great question. They were able to build up their military during the 1920s and the 1930s after they had been imperialistic and taking over places like Manchuria. And then when they conquered islands throughout the Pacific, like the Philippines, they were able to get access to rubber and other sorts of things that they would need for their war effort. You are hitting on a key idea, though, that during the war itself, like when you have the Battle of Midway and Japan loses a number of their aircraft carriers, they don't have the resources to build brand new aircraft carriers during the war. It took them that period of the Washington Naval Conference where they moved out in the 30s from that conference and started building rapidly. It took them all that time just to build the boats that they had at the moment. Meanwhile, America has all the raw materials to take a bunch of the ships that were beat up during the Battle of Pearl Harbor and repair them so they're back in the ocean by 1942, 1943. They take some aircraft carriers that get deeply damaged during the war and actually rebuild them and refurbish them and get them back in the fight again. So America's got the industrial capability that Japan doesn't have, where Japan is really rolling the dice with Pearl Harbor. If they win Pearl Harbor, there's a chance to win World War II if they can wipe out the American Navy. But the fact that they didn't, especially the aircraft carriers, meant that from that point forward, Japan had moments where they were becoming assertive, especially the Battle of Midway. But it was really at that moment where Japan took their shot, and then they're watching as America can outproduce them from that point forward. Let me see here. Next question, Christian Scott. Did the economic stimulus provided by FDR have a huge impact on the South's development? Absolutely. So think about those regions like the area of the TVA that was now full of power plants from the Tennessee River. They can now build factories that are building war materials. And in fact, it's in that area that they're going to have one of their nuclear facilities that's working on the Manhattan Project because of the power that's now being generated by the TVA. There are people moving to the south and to the west, especially with the introduction of air conditioning during this time period. And so you're finding that there's a whole new group of people moving these places, especially since that's where our military bases are located. And so there's going to be a gigantic economic boom that's going to continue through the 50s and 60s. So we're going to see a lot of people moving south and west as a result of the move that you see here. And in fact, if you want to get a better perspective on that, if you're a baseball fan, think about teams like the Los Angeles Dodgers and the San Francisco Giants. Both of them were New York baseball teams that during this time period, right after World War II is done, they're going to make the move out west as well, because they've now got huge populations of people living in California that hadn't been there previously. Let me see here. Christian, I see your question about the quarantine speech. Hopefully my answer for that earlier helped you out. What impact did the Allies have on the war by launching an assault on North Africa? The key, and like I was mentioning just in the last moment, is trying to stop the movement of Germany into the oil-rich areas of the Middle East, and help the British hold on to some of their colonies. And then hopefully the idea was to peel off Italy because it was the weakest of the Axis powers, and then slowly work its way through Italy up north into Germany. But that would have required movement through the Alps, which would have taken a long time. And so we're going to find that that plan is going to be pushed to the side, and D-Day is going to be the way that we go instead. Is there anything in the war that sowed the seeds for the Cold War? That's a very astute question, and that's definitely going to be where we go for the next 4 chapters. Where for the Russians, they do feel like they've been attacked repeatedly from all sides because they're viewed as being weak. They're viewed as being dangerous for being communist. They are naturally very insecure about the fact that they have been attacked on all sides repeatedly. And so especially during World War II, when they are forced to take the brunt of the warfare, and they're taking the attacks from Germany, and they are holding out Stalingrad and just barely hanging on, and their casualty rates, they lose millions while America loses thousands during this war. There's very much a feeling after the end of the war is done that Russia's going to try to take over as much of Eastern Europe as they can to create a buffer zone. So if anybody ever tries to attack them again, they're going to have to go through multiple countries like Poland or Czechoslovakia or other countries like that. There's also a goal that they have to spy like crazy on the United States, because they know the Americans are working on an atomic bomb, and if the Russians can get a hold of one themselves, they will then be safe. And in fact, that's what I'd like you to notice when you're watching the news nowadays. Like we're watching currently, North Korea has now developed a nuclear bomb, and you'll notice that the president is spending a lot of time talking with North Korea now, which he wouldn't do if they didn't have a nuclear weapon. He'd be invading them instead, but because they have nuclear weapons, they're now a threat. Iran has wanted them for a while, particularly for that reason. So we'll find that this is essentially where the Cold War is going to come from, is Russia feels like they need to do things to protect themselves because of the way that they've been attacked over the previous century. Let me see here. Christian, also your question about whether or not I like war stories that students bring to me. I would absolutely welcome any stories that you guys have. The one that I have is before he passed away in his late 90s, just this past year. I had a great uncle who fought in the Pacific, and he was island hopping with MacArthur. He received numerous medals as he worked his way across the ocean. He was a lower ranked officer, so he was commanding men, and he was wounded multiple times in saving men as he was going through island hopping. And then when he came back home, since he was fighting south of the Mason-Dixon line, he came home with malaria, and he spent the next multiple months, while everybody else was celebrating the end of World War II, he spent multiple months sitting in front of a pot-bellied stove, even during the summertime, because the malaria would take over his body, give him chills, and he'd feel like he was freezing, even though it was like 80-plus degrees outside. And so having somebody who sacrificed a ton to go off to war, I have a very soft spot for stories like his. and others. So if you want to share, that's absolutely fine. So feel free to buzz by with any questions like that. And in particular, that kind of segues into what my point is. You are now at the point where you're wrapping up period 7. You are now into your immediate family's history. It would do you well, because when I found out about my family member's history, I made sure to videotape him and his wife to ask them questions about the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way up to the present. And he had recollections of my family members who came from Germany in the 1800s. This is where you get to put together your history class with what's going on in your family. And so I would encourage you, when you're studying World War II, nudge your parents and find out what their stories about World War II are. Same with each of the units that we're covering for the rest of our course, because I think you'll get a lot more out of the class when you find out how your family is connected to those moments. Let me take a look here and see if I've got any other last minute questions. I see nothing for period 2. Period 4, we are all good. Period 6, looking good too. Good luck with your studying tonight. I hope tomorrow's test goes well for you. And then remember, you've got an essay that's going to be happening on Wednesday, where you'll be bringing the typed essay into class with you. Hopefully this test helps clarify the end point for where you'd want that essay to go about how World War I changed our views on foreign policy. And feel free to ask me any questions about that writing, because we want this to be a really good experience for you, where you test drive out your skills, and then I want you to be able to figure out if you're online for the rubric itself. Thanks for all your hard work over this weekend, and hopefully tomorrow goes well.